First, I want to tell you about sort of what I would think is like some of the state-of-the-art research happening in labor economics that's letting us look at kind of labor market institutions in a new way. So here's the thought experiment. Imagine that you cut wages by 10%. What do you expect? How many of your workers do you expect to lose? And so basically the way that economists used to think about the labor market was like, oh, actually, pretty quickly you're going to lose all of your workers. And the competition will poach them, and they'll just and they'll just go away. And so what that implies is that the market is going to pin down the wages of every worker in the economy based on their skills and talent. And so there's going to be one market value for someone, and so that's why we sort of focus so much on skills and human capital and things as the ways in which to raise wages, because the market sort of sets the value of those skills. But recent research has actually showed that the same worker gets different wages at different firms. And that the firm is like a really important determinant of people's wages. And one of the ways we can get a sense for how big and how important these frictions are is by seeing how sensitive turnover is to these firm effects in the wage. So this is a graph I made from matched worker firm hourly wage data from Oregon. So the data sets that have let us look at this are basically the availability of these administrative data sets that have workers linked to their employers for the whole labor market, and they're generally coming from like UI records or something like that. And so this is that from Oregon. And what's on the x-axis is basically the firm component of wage. It's basically like thinking about there's some high wage firms and some low wage firms. And then on the y-axis is the separations rate. So basically what you can think of is when you walk along the x-axis, how quickly do separations fall? So as a firm starts paying a higher wage, how much lower is its turnover? And you know, it falls as you'd expect, but the slope is actually pretty gentle when you actually compute the number. And so the implied actual estimate here winds up being that if a firm cuts its wages by 10%, which is a pretty big wage cut, it'll actually only lose about maybe 30% of its workers. And so that means that it makes a lot of sense for firms to think, all right, I'm gonna like lower wages by a little bit. I might have to suffer some additional turnover, but it's worth it because I'm sort of saving on the wage bill for all these other workers. And because turnover is actually not super sensitive to the wage, it's somewhat sensitive, but not super sensitive, it means that employers would basically have some market power in the labor market. So that just in the same way that a monopolist or any business thinks, well, you know, we need to make a margin off of every unit sold, a monopsonist or a person with labor market or a firm with labor market power thinks, oh yeah, we can make a profit off every worker employed. And what that means is there's a gap between the wage paid to a worker and the amount of revenue they're generating for the firm. In an older day, we would have called that the exploitation rate. And one of the really interesting things, and one of the other reasons we're able to see this is actually because of the rise of gig economy kind of jobs, which lets us, as researchers, go into labor markets as experimenters and like actually just participate as employers, randomize the wage ourselves, and then see how sensitive people are to like our experiment as a function of the wage. And so we sort of did this on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which I'm sure at least some of you know about, which is this big online crowdsourcing platform. Thousands of employers, thousands of workers, big, thick labor market, only online. You'd expect this to look as close to the kind of economics 101 labor market model where there's just one market wage as any labor market you'd expect. Turns out even on this labor market, especially on this labor market, the sensitivity of workers to the wage posted by a given employer is super low. And the reason is that people really like doing different kinds of tasks. And some people really like doing some kinds of tasks, and other people really like doing other kinds of tasks. And so the wage is actually a really small part of the value that they get from the job. And so that means that employers can kind of lowball the wage, and they're reasonably sure they're going to get someone at some point. And so it turns out that like even on this very, very thick online labor market, there's a substantial amount of market power by employers. And so that should be like a proof of concept that, yeah, that if this labor market looks that way, how much more sticky and how much more rigid are actual real-world labor markets. And so if firms have this wage-setting power, which the term of art is monopsony, which I'll probably put somewhere on my gravestone, is that firms are going to make some of their profit by lowering wages and accepting the resulting turnover. And this is going to increase profit, but it's going to come at the cost of lower wages and lower employment. And it's also going to be inefficient, particularly if you're funding most of your government, which we do, off of payroll taxes. Like most taxes fall on labor income. And so that basically means that every dollar that an employer is like underpaying their workers is also then kind of multiplied by the tax rate, is turning into a smaller take for the fiscal system, which means you just have less tax revenue. And so then if you're using, then that means like less money available for public goods and things like that. So you can kind of get a sense of like, as you increase, as you can think of the thought experiment, as you increase the amount of this market power that employers have over wages, you kind of get these distortions, and that's kind of, that graph kind of shows how much the distortions go up, and those two red lines are the kind of bounds we think are there in the real world. Like, we don't have an exact pin on it, but within those are the kind of range of the estimates that exist in the literature. You can imagine that we're like losing a lot of money, and we're losing a lot of, we're leaving a lot of money on the table by, not kind of having institutions that fix this monopsony problem. So why are we only seeing this now? And monopsony has been around for at least 70 years as an idea, but everyone sort of thought it was just a problem in like company towns or like Columbia University. These are the only institutions that really have like monopsony power. But I think one of the things that sort of happened is that the decline of unions, the declining real value of the minimum wage, and sort of more and more of the labor market exempt from wage regulation has sort of basically mean that we can like see monopsony power in the labor market where before it was kind of restrained by all these other institutions. And so now we can kind of see what a more or less a fair labor market looks like. And it turns out it doesn't look like supply equals demand, it looks much more like monopsony. And the other part, like I said, the gig economy makes it easy for us to run experiments, and so that gives us another, that we can actually measure this very cleanly. And then the other thing that's been happening is that in rural labor markets, there's just been an enormous amount of consolidation in primary production and in rural manufacturing. So you basically have like more one-company towns, one-mine towns. And so my hometown is actually Cornerbrook, Newfoundland, and it's in fact a one-company town of like a pulp and paper mill, and everyone works at the pulp and paper mill. So it previews where I'm going with it. And the reason that I think worked was that it was a union pulp and paper mill, and so the union wound up exercising countervailing power on the market power that the mill had. But the other thing that's been happening is that outsourcing and kind of, before it used to be that IBM would have its own janitors, but now it's that IBM hires a janitorial firm. And so that like fissuring of the workplace that Dan Wells documented has talked about a lot has kind of caused the previous ideas that like, oh, we're all in this together. So basically even the janitors at IBM are kind of sharing in IBM's revenues. So that's just stopped. And it's gone away, and so that might mean that like firms are much more willing to exercise the monopsony power that they have. And then there's kind of other things about just job lock due to healthcare's increasing share of compensation. So people are hanging on to jobs because they need the healthcare benefits, and so that gives employers like leverage over wages because of employer-provided health insurance. And then there's kind of the things that kind of really make the news, which are things like non-competes and no poaching agreements. So like Jiffy Lube basically makes it a condition of all of their franchisees that you're not allowed to hire somebody else that has worked at another Jiffy Lube. And so it's basically like cartelizing the labor market just via franchises. Part of that has come with the rise of like putting mandatory arbitration into more and more labor contracts. So some policy implications of this before I talk about unions is just that one of the consequences of this is that monopsony, because it's inducing this excessively high turnover, just means that it's harder to get workers to invest in firm-specific skills. Like they're like, you can't promise me that you're going to have a job for me in 3 years, so why should I invest in the particular skills that you need for me for this job? Another sort of policy implication, one of the things I've worked on is just kind of talking about how antitrust law basically actually already has a bunch of the tools to handle this, like particularly the consolidation in rural manufacturing, and just has by tradition just never been applied to the labor market, but it's purely a convention. There's nothing in the law or nothing in the economics that means that you couldn't just start throwing the Sherman Act at employers and going after violations of antitrust by employers. But more broadly, you think the point of this is that, you know, if the laissez-faire or like deregulated labor market is one in which employers have this wage setting power, the right solution is kind of policies that restrain the exercise of that wage setting power. And unions kind of obviously did this in the past, in the sense that you had a collective bargaining agreement, you did not get to choose the wage, you had to bargain across the table with a union that would put the threat of a strike on you. And you know, yes, probably it would be great to get back to high union density, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but let's just be real, like, to get to 30% union density, you need 70 million workers joining unions. That's just, that would just take some sort of really radical shock to the U.S. political economy to get that. Minimum wages work at the bottom, and it's one of the reasons monopsony sort of got a boost in the U.S. economics, because you know, it was this puzzle why the minimum wage wasn't destroying jobs, and so monopsony sort of arose as a candidate explanation for why the minimum wage doesn't show up as employment losses. But the worst monopsony, I'm going to argue, is not at the low end of the labor market. It's actually kind of in the high end of the labor market, and that's kind of that means that the minimum wage is a really blunt tool for fighting monopsony. The right tool, that's actually like Australia's kind of a good model of this, is sectoral wage bargaining, where you basically have this like these 3-member panels that kind of decide what the wage should be in a given occupational industry group, and that's kind of how you set wages throughout the labor market. You know, another one is like co-determination. Even union pension funds can do this. You know, basically, like, as long as you have some sort of worker voice on the board of directors, you basically would just have them have a reason for them to like dictate pay practices and just say, don't exercise your labor market power and lower wages. And some piece of evidence of this is like co-determined firms in Germany have like less turnover, and they actually want to, and their investors actually see that, and so co-determined firms in Germany are actually able to get financing on better terms than non-co-determined firms, because like the investments that they make are more likely to be these long-term investments for their workers that are more likely to stay on. Okay, so, and the connection to kind of the union side of this is that monopsony means that unions that we might have thought of were like these costly bureaucratic organizations, they make them actually, like, gives them a range over which their free lunch is. But I want to sort of specifically focus on sectoral unions here, because there's a different kettle of fish with firm level unions, which is like one union in a company, and what's the easier case to make is about sectoral unions that negotiate wages for like a whole mass of firms in one labor market. So think New York City real estate. SEIU 32BJ negotiates master contracts with all of the buildings covered by the contract, and so they set wages and like for all the doormen. And so, you know, if an employer now has to set wages at the union scale, they're going to see falls in turnover. But they're also going to see lower returns to skill. So one of the things that unions do is they put in seniority clauses that are sort of guaranteeing that promotion will be on the basis of experience, and that's going to depress the returns to skill. And so you might see high skill workers leave, which is something that we do see in recent periods. But it's also going to lower profits, and I think that's just real. Like, it's going to really have to lower profits to raise wages, and there's just not kind of like a way around it. It's not there's very little of a you know that at least what unions did was that they depressed CEO pay partly because when you had to negotiate with a union that could see your books, it was really hard to justify really a high CEO pay, because then you basically cut, you know, on the other side of the table, you'd be like, why are you giving the CEO so much money when, you know, and not just sort of like raising the wage. So So the work I want to finish with is just just talking about the historical experience of unions in the U.S. And part of the work that we've done. It turns out that almost all of the evidence that we have on unions in the U.S. Come from post-1973, because that's when the Bureau of Labor Statistics started asking workers about union membership. So basically, everything we know about unions has come from this period of secular union decline. And so this paper I have with co-authors, we sort of realized that Gallup, the polling organization, had actually asked union status in every survey going back to 1936. So then when you start putting together these monthly polls, you start getting a very large data set that measures union, that you can measure union density in a really consistent way, going all the way back to 1936. And you can see the increase in unions in individual level data that you couldn't see before. And plus, they often ask household income. So you can also then kind of see how much union households were making relative to non-union households. And one sort of the striking finding, I'll show you the graph in a sec, is just how stable the union premium is. So union density goes up from almost nothing to 30% in 2 decades, then it starts slowly coming down until we're back down to below single-digit union density today. But over that whole period, the union premium is basically somewhere between 15 and 20%. Doesn't move very much. And then we can also construct patterns of state year union density back to 1935 and just kind of look at the ecological correlation between union density and inequality. And so it turns out unions lower inequality in a whole bunch of margins, much more so than just raising the wages of their members. It's it turns out they wind up, raising labor share, they lower top 10% income, and so there's just a whole macro effect of unionization on the labor market, it goes above and beyond just the union wage agreement. So this is what the 20th century union density looks like just over time. So you see this U shape, and this is kind of the graph that motivates a lot of economists to think that unions are really important. It's really suspiciously coincident that these U shapes in national inequality are sort of so sharply associated with the negative U in union density. So it's just suspicious. So, and then when you look at the union, this is just showing that the union income premium is pretty stable over time. And then the other thing that unions do is they lower the returns to skilled labor. So if you think of one of the things going on is that skilled workers are making so much more than unskilled workers, well, unions put a clamp on that. And then the kind of major, I think, surprising result in this is just what's changed as union density has gone up and gone down is who's in unions. So actually today, who's in unions? It's mostly skilled workers. And it's there's just not the period peak union density in the 50s and 60s. That's when the people that were in unions were largely less skilled than average. And then as union density has fallen, the people that have left unions have been the low-skilled workers. And that's not just the public sector. It's even in manufacturing, even in construction, the relatively skilled people are still the ones in unions. And so I just want to end with this last fact, is that the other thing that all this historical survey data lets us do, it actually turns out there's a bunch of surveys that ask father's income. So you can do intergenerational mobility going way back, I think a little bit before 36, which we do in the DSS, so we can go back to 1910. And so we can actually see this one period in which intergenerational mobility was falling was for cohorts born between 1910 and 1930, and then it stabilizes up until where this is the same value that it is today. And one of the things that's going on is that unions actually have one of the, in all the variables we looked at, unions have one of the largest effects on reducing intergenerational persistence, on increasing mobility. So if you want to think about it, the sons that are union members, their correlation with their father's income basically falls to 0. So there's no effect of father's income on own income inside the union sector, and it's then much larger in the non-union sector. And so basically, unions also damp down the effect of your father's on your own income. So just to sum up, so unregulated labor markets give employers market power. Employers, when not constrained by anything else, are going to use that market power to lower wages and it's going to increase turnover. Unions had a role in the sense that they took away that employer ability to set wages, but they also redistributed from skilled and white workers to, I didn't talk about this, but there's also a big race component in the union density thing, which goes against, I think, our normal preconceptions about what unions are. Turns out non-white workers are more likely to be union members than white workers, and the union premium for non-white workers is higher than the union premium for white workers. So there's like a, they both redistribute by years of schooling, but then they also redistribute across race. So across all of these things that we were looking at in this paper, like access to the unionized labor market was like the single thing that like knocked down the effect of parents' income more than schooling, more than sort of anything else. Was it's kind of like having the access to this like unionized labor market that kind of washed out the effect of your father's of your parental background on your own income. And so it's just kind of, I think it's a theme in the presentation today that like, equality of outcomes is kind of an important input into equality of opportunity. I think there's just like no way that you get equality of opportunity without also sort of radically compressing the outcomes. And that's what sort of unions did in the US. Do I take questions? Yes. Okay.
Hi. So I think this was really interesting in terms of the historical value of unions. I'm wondering, moving forward, what you think the role of unions needs to play, especially in terms of another kind of threat to jobs, which is automation.
Yeah, I actually think they're like super complementary. So like Germany has actually been ahead of the US in automation adoption, partly because of what the unions have negotiated. It's like basically a union, one of the things you can put into a collective bargaining agreement is if our jobs are going to be threatened, you're going to pay us out, you're going to give us really fat severance pay, for example. And so a lot of, for example, the longshore workers on the West Coast, one of the things they negotiate is like they see the productivity increases that are coming with port automation, but they just negotiated big severance packages and big pension packages out of that, so that they're like, okay, we get that there's going to be technological change in this industry that are not necessarily going to mean that you need to keep employment up, but you have to share those productivity gains with us is part of the goal. And I think if you wanted to kind of get an economy in which the benefits of technological change don't just go to owners, your kind of an important role for collective bargaining agreements is to in fact write those things into labor market contracts, so that if you're going to fire us all, you have to pay us a lot of money. And I think that is that's one thing that unions can actually facilitate.
Can you say something about, those of us who like raising wages and raising the minimum wage, talk about decreasing the cost of turnover. Can you say something about the relationship? If there's lower wages and turnover is increased, does that lessen the savings of lowering wages?
Yeah, so it does, in the sense that like that's why there's kind of like a free lunch here, is that like, oh, when you raise wages over some range, you see turnover fall, and that winds up being that you're going to then see employment. That's what causes for some firms their employment increases. Because what you see when you raise the minimum wage, and the evidence is pretty clear on this. Yes, you see no effect on employment, but what you do see is that firms start hiring fewer new workers. But you also see that workers stop leaving for other firms. And so the net effect of like recruitment and separations kind of cancel each other out. And that's kind of the minimum wage evidence that's sort of why it's such a wash in terms of like net employment. Both of those things fall, and they fall by roughly the same amounts. But the important part of that is that this is costly to employers. And so even though it's like a kind of free lunch in terms of jobs, employers don't like it because it cuts into profits. And so they'll raise hue and cry over like the effects of the minimum wage on them because it's coming out of profits. That basically they were doing a profit maximizing level of turnover, and now they are no longer doing, now they're sort of have to lower their turnover in a way that actually reduces profits.
Is there a cost to turnover?
there is a cost to turnover, but employers are willing to bear it in order to pay the lower wages.
Their point at which that's no longer true.
Yeah, so that's what I'm like, but firms will always sort of pick the point at which they're like, okay, turnover's too costly, we can't lower wages any further. But the point is that that level is always going to be a lower level of wages than what would be kind of like the, economy-wide that would maximize employment or maximize output. So yeah, firms are always going to be like, oh yeah, no, sorry, that's too much. But even that level is going to be too low of a wage.
You had said that the share of union workers that are high-skilled has risen versus the share that's low-skilled. What are some of the drivers of that over the years?
So I think it's like where you look at where union density has really collapsed, and where employers are the most hostile to unions is actually when you're organizing low-skilled workers. And so where you look at where right-to-work laws are passed, and when you look at where employer opposition campaigns are kind of the most intense, it's often when it's like organizing low-skilled workers. And so it's probably because like the profit loss on each one of those workers is just larger for a company. And so they're just going to throw way more. So like it's easy to say, oh yeah, we'll have a union for relatively skilled workers and we'll pay them a higher wage, and that actually doesn't cost nearly as much to a firm, versus raising some lower skilled worker, like giving them a big wage cut. You can imagine that's like a much larger bite into the wage bill. And so I think like part of it is like employer opposition to unionization. Not all of it. It's, some of it is technological, but it's not so easy. It's not just manufacturing that has this pattern. It's like they're in transportation, it's there in construction. It's kind of like every sector that we have is seeing this upskilling of what union members they have left.
One last one up here.
Can you speak a little bit about globalization, how obviously that I'm sure has impacted unions and factories closing, jobs moving, and then how any of the tariff wars or, could potentially, or, would there be an impact on unions growing back again in the US?
So we have to realize that a large chunk of the whole globalization thing is a story about tradable goods. It's manufacturing. And the manufacturing share now is like so low. Manufacturing share of employment now, some are probably below 12%. And so it's just like not where the US economy, and manufacturing sector has been declining since like 1956. It's almost 1-for-1 with union decline is manufacturing decline. And so a lot of where globalization is hitting is like, yes, there is a highly unionized manufacturing sector that has declined, and that has declined both because of globalization and everything else. The rise of finance, all these things has also like kind of really hammered manufacturing, and with that has come a decimation of unions. I think the bigger puzzle though is like we have a very large services sector that, the American labor movement and no labor movement outside of say the GET system countries has really figured out how to like organize services. And as the economy becomes more and more service oriented, it's kind of a puzzle to me why you can't, like, if you just think about it, right, these are non-tradables. The workspaces are open to the public. There's like, you don't have to do these complicated SALT organizing strategies where you go undercover into this private space. And it's not as vulnerable to automation the way that manufacturing is. So it's kind of, and so the response is that because so many service sector employers are low margin employers, once you try to raise wages in it, they just go out of business, and so you're just left. So I think it's that because the structure of the labor movement has been around organizing individual businesses, because it's this firm-oriented thing, so that when you go firm by firm, you just can't do it in the services sector because they're all a bunch of like low margin firms. But that's why you kind of need these sectoral strategies, or like you need to get at a level of the labor market that's larger than any one business. You've got to kind of get the whole market. I'm just speculating there, though. That's it. Yeah.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah.